Mark Reynolds had always believed that moving forward was the only way to survive the worst of life. He'd had his share of heartbreak, more than his fair share. His wife, Emily, had been the love of his life, the center of his world, and when he lost her to a sudden illness, the world itself had gone dark. But Mark didn't have the luxury of staying lost in that darkness. He had Toby, their 6-year-old son, their entire world wrapped up in one little boy, and that meant one thing: he had to keep going. That was why he'd made the decision to move to Oak Hollow, a seemingly peaceful neighborhood just outside of the city. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where he and Toby could rebuild their lives together. The house was modest but comfortable, with a backyard big enough for Toby to run around in, a tree perfect for hanging a swing, and a friendly atmosphere that Mark hoped would give his son the stability he deserved. At first, things seemed promising. Neighbors waved when they passed. Kids rode their bikes on the sidewalks, and Mark could almost convince himself that this was the kind of place where a kid could grow up safe, happy, and free. Then they met Karen Matheson. She introduced herself within 24 hours of their moving truck pulling into the driveway. Mark had been unpacking boxes, sweat dripping down his back. We saw her marching up the walkway. A woman in her early 50s, her blonde bob styled so perfectly that it didn't move when the wind blew, a clipboard in one hand and a self-important expression plastered on her face. Mark wiped his hands on his jeans and forced a polite smile as she came to a stop at the edge of his porch. "You must be Mr. Reynolds," she said, as though she were the one welcoming him into her kingdom rather than the other way around. "That's right," Mark said. "And you are Karen Matheson, head of the Oak Hollow Community Committee." She glanced at the clipboard in her hands, flipping through pages of what appeared to be notes. "I like to personally introduce myself to new residents. Helps keep things running smoothly around here." Mark had a bad feeling immediately. Still, he played nice, shook her hand, and let her rattle off a list of neighborhood expectations. Lawn care regulations, garbage collection schedules, local events. It was the kind of overbearing micromanagement that would have made Emily laugh out loud. But then the conversation took a weird turn. "And where is Mrs. Reynolds?" Karen asked, tilting her head just slightly, like she already knew the answer. Mark felt his stomach tighten. It was always a question he hated answering, not just because of the pain it carried, but because of how people reacted. Pity, awkwardness, unnecessary apologies. "Passed away last year," Mark said simply. Karen's eyes widened just a little, but it wasn't sympathy that Mark saw flash across her face. It was something else. Something calculating. "Oh," she said too quickly. "That must be difficult." Mark nodded, already wanting to end the conversation. "Yeah, well, Toby and I are doing okay." Karen's expression didn't shift. "And how old is Toby?" 6. Her lip curled slightly, though she smoothed it out so quickly that Mark almost missed it. "That's quite young," she said, her voice dripping with something condescending. "And you're raising him alone?" Mark exhaled slowly. He knew this kind of person, the type that had already made up their mind about him before he even had a chance to prove himself. "Yes," he said, his tone firm. "And he's doing great." Karen smiled, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile a school principal gives a troublemaker on their first day of class: reserved judgment, fake politeness, and a promise that she'd be watching. "Well," she said, clasping her hands together, "if you need any parenting advice, I'd be happy to help. We have certain standards in Oak Hollow, and it's important that all children are raised properly." Mark clenched his jaw. There it was. He forced a smile. "I appreciate the offer, but I think I've got it covered." Karen's smile never wavered, but Mark could tell she didn't like that answer. "Well," she said, flipping through her clipboard again, "I'll be sure to check in. We take care of each other here in Oak Hollow." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement like a metronome, counting down to inevitable trouble. The first signs of trouble. From that moment on, Karen made a point to insert herself into Mark's life at every opportunity. She'd show up unannounced, lingering outside his house when Toby played in the yard, making passive-aggressive comments about how kids need a mother's touch. She'd leave printed articles on his porch about the importance of two-parent households, as if he needed a reminder that Emily was gone. She would bump into him at the grocery store, in the park, at school pickup, always finding a way to slip in some kind of disapproval. And then came the complaints. First, there was a note on his door. "Your lawn is overgrown by 2 inches past HOA regulation. Please correct this immediately." Then another. Your garbage bins were left out 30 minutes past collection. This is not acceptable in Oak Hollow. Mark knew exactly where these were coming from. He even caught Karen peering through his fence once, watching as he helped Toby ride his bike. It was obsessive, creepy, overbearing. But Mark didn't engage. He figured that if he ignored her, she'd get bored and move on. He couldn't have been more wrong. Because Karen wasn't just some nosy neighbor with too much time on her hands. She had decided that Mark was unfit to be a parent. And soon, she was going to do something about it. Mark had dealt with judgmental people before. Being a single father came with its fair share of side eyes and unsolicited advice. People assuming he wasn't capable, that he didn't know how to cook, that he was some clueless man fumbling through fatherhood. But Karen was different. Her judgment wasn't just passive disapproval, it was a mission. And Mark was about to learn just how far she was willing to go. It started subtly, the way all manipulative people start their attacks. Karen didn't just disapprove of Mark's parenting, she tried to reshape it. It began with suggestions. I noticed Toby's out playing a lot. Are you sure that's safe? I saw you making PB&J for his lunch. Did he have any allergies? You should really check with a specialist. You're letting him pick out his own clothes? That's sweet, but kids need structure. Mark ignored her. At first. But then came the direct interference. One afternoon, Mark took Toby to the park. A normal day. A fun day. He let Toby run ahead toward the swings, keeping a watchful eye on him while he sat on a bench just a few feet away. Karen was there, of course. She was always there. She watched from a distance, her arms folded, her expression tight. Mark could feel her gaze boring into him, but he didn't react. He had learned not to engage. But then, she made her first move. While Mark was looking at his phone for just a second, Karen strode across the playground with that same entitled confidence she always carried. Mark barely had time to process what she was doing before she was right next to Toby, reaching out and gripping his wrist. Mark stood up so fast that his chair scraped against the pavement. Hey, he called, already moving toward them. What do you think you're doing? Karen turned, her face the epitome of calm. Oh, she said, feigning surprise. I was just making sure he was all right. Mark stared at her, Toby's tiny wrist still in her grasp. Let him go. Karen huffed but released her hold. She smoothed down her blouse, tilting her head like he was overreacting. There's no need to get upset, Mark, she said. I just noticed he was playing alone, and I thought. Mark stepped between her and Toby. He wasn't alone. I was watching. Karen sighed like he was a child throwing a tantrum. Mark, she said, her voice dropping into that condescending tone he hated. I know you think you're doing your best, but raising a boy alone, it's difficult. Sometimes it's easy to overlook little things. Mark's jaw clenched. Like what? He said through gritted teeth. Karen smiled sweetly. Like the fact that he's running around without a jacket. Mark glanced down. Toby was fine, red cheek from running, sure, but not cold. Not uncomfortable. Karen continued, stepping closer, lowering her voice like she was revealing a secret. I've seen it before, she whispered. Good men, loving fathers, but inexperienced. Mark exhaled slowly. She wanted a reaction. He refused to give her one. Instead, he bent down, cupped Toby's face gently, and smiled. You cold, buddy? Toby shook his head, giggling. No, Daddy. Mark stood back up, staring Karen down. Then we're good. Karen's face twitched. She wanted control. And when she didn't get it, she made her next move. The CPS call. The first visit from Child Protective Services came 3 days later. Mark was washing dishes when the knock came, sharp, official, deliberate. He wiped his hands, peeked through the window, and felt his stomach drop. 2 people stood on his porch. A man and a woman, dressed professionally, clipboards in hand. He opened the door. Mark Reynolds, the woman asked. Mark nodded. Yeah. The man beside her offered a practiced, sympathetic smile. We're from Child Protective Services. We received a report about potential neglect regarding your son, Toby. Mark's blood ran cold. He already knew who had made the call. Can we come in? The woman asked. Mark swallowed hard, stepping aside. Yeah, of course. The next hour was one of the most humiliating experiences of his life. They checked everything. His fridge, Toby's room, the bathroom, the first aid kit. They asked condescending questions. What does he eat? What's his bedtime? How often does he bathe? Mark answered every single one through gritted teeth. The worst part? They had to interview Toby. He sat on the couch, swinging his legs, confused but obedient, answering every question with innocent honesty. What do you and your dad do together? We play baseball. And he makes pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. Has your daddy ever left you home alone? Toby giggled. That's silly. No. By the time the visit ended, the CPS workers exchanged a glance. Well, the woman said, closing her folder, everything seems to be in order. But we do have to follow up. Mark's stomach twisted. Follow up. The man nodded. We'll need to check back in standard procedure. Mark's fists clenched at his sides. Standard procedure. He walked them to the door, holding himself together until they drove away. Then, he let out a slow, shaking breath. Karen. It was Karen. She had reported him. He had played nice. He had ignored her. But now, she had crossed a line. And Mark knew one thing for sure, this wasn't over. Not even close. Mark had always believed in picking his battles. Being a single father meant learning how to let things go, how to focus on what really mattered instead of getting caught up in petty nonsense. But this wasn't something he could ignore. Karen had crossed a line. It wasn't about her nosy interference anymore. It wasn't even about her constant, passive-aggressive comments. She had called CPS. She had tried to brand him as an unfit parent. And now, every time Mark heard a knock on the door, his stomach twisted because he knew there was always a chance that someone could show up to take his son away. But Karen, she wasn't finished yet. Because the next time she made a move, she took Toby. The abduction. It was a Saturday afternoon, sunny and warm, and Mark had finally let himself relax for the first time in days. Toby was in the front yard, chasing bubbles, laughing as Mark sat on the porch, sipping a cold glass of lemonade, watching him play. It was peaceful. Normal. Then Mark's phone buzzed. A text from his boss. A quick work question. He glanced at the screen for maybe 20 seconds. That was all it took. Because when he looked up, Toby was gone. The yard was empty. The sidewalk was empty. The bubbles floated through the air, untouched. Mark's heart stopped. He dropped his phone, his glass shattering on the porch as he bolted off the steps. Toby? He called, his voice already panicked, shaky. No answer. His chest tightened, his stomach flipping in terror as he scanned the street. Then he saw it. Karen's SUV. The driver's side door slammed shut, and in the passenger seat, through the tinted window, was a small figure, curled up, crying. Toby. Mark's body moved before his brain could catch up. He sprinted toward the car, heart pounding, his voice booming. Stop the car. But Karen, cold, smug, psychotic Karen, just flashed him a smile through the windshield and drove away. Mark ran. God, he ran. His feet hit the pavement so hard it felt like his bones might crack, but the SUV was already pulling away, already disappearing down the road. Mark gasped for breath, his hand shaking violently as he reached for his phone, barely able to dial 911. The operator answered, but Mark could barely get the words out. My son's been taken. The confrontation. It didn't take Mark long to find her. Because Karen was too confident. She thought she was doing the right thing. She had taken Toby back to her house, parking the driveway like she had just come home from the grocery store, as if she hadn't just committed a felony. Mark's truck came to a screeching halt in front of her house, his tires kicking up dust as he jumped out, heart racing. He didn't think, didn't plan, didn't hesitate. He just ran to her door and pounded on it, so hard his knuckles burned. Open the door, Karen. For a second, nothing. Then, the door creaked open. And there she stood, completely calm, smiling. Mark, she said smoothly, as if she were inviting him in for coffee. Mark pushed past her, stepping inside. He didn't care about politeness. He didn't care about rules. All he cared about was finding his son. Toby, he called, his voice borderline frantic. Then he heard it, a sniffle. And there, in the living room, sat Toby, curled up on the couch, clutching a stuffed dinosaur, his face red and puffy from crying. Mark dropped to his knees immediately. Hey, buddy, he said, voice gentle, shaking. You okay? Toby nodded weakly, but didn't say anything. Mark turned to Karen, barely able to contain his rage. What the hell is wrong with you? Karen crossed her arms. I saved him, she said matter-of-factly. Mark's jaw tightened. You kidnapped my son, Karen. Karen scoffed. Mark, you left him alone. A 6-year-old, outside, unsupervised? That's neglect. Mark's hands curled into fists. I was watching him. Karen raised an eyebrow. Were you? Mark's heart pounded in his ears. She was insane. Actually insane. And then? She pulled out her phone, held it up, and smiled. I've already called CPS, she said. I told them you abandoned your child and that I had to step in. The police are on their way. Mark's blood went ice cold. She had planned this. She had actually planned this. She thought she could steal his son and get away with it. But what Karen didn't know was that Mark had planned too. His house had security cameras, and those cameras had caught everything. The tide turns. Mark's anger vanished, replaced with something colder. He pulled out his phone, and with one click, he pulled up the footage. Karen's smug smile faltered. Market play. The video showed everything. Karen walking into his yard, grabbing Toby's hand, pulling him toward her car while he struggled, loading him in and driving off. Karen's face went completely pale. Mark looked up, holding her gaze. You kidnapped my son, he said, his voice calm, steady, terrifying. You're the criminal here, Karen. And when the cops get here, he stepped closer. You're the one who's going to jail. Karen staggered back. I was just. The sound of police sirens cut her off. She turned, her eyes wild with panic. And Mark? For the first time in days, he felt in control again. Because Karen was finished. The wail of police sirens cut through the air, a sound that had never been more welcome to Mark Reynolds in his entire life. He stood in Karen's doorway, his phone in his grip, the security footage still playing, the damning evidence flashing across the screen. Karen's face had drained of color, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She had been so confident, so sure she could manipulate the situation, but now the weight of reality was crashing down on her. Toby sat on a couch, still clutching his stuffed dinosaur, his face streaked with tears. Mark's heart ached seeing his little boy so scared, but right now, he had to deal with a monster who had caused this. Karen took a step back, her hands trembling. Mark, wait, she started, her voice high, frantic. Mark didn't wait. He stepped past her, scooping Toby up in his arms, holding his son close to his chest. The second Toby wrapped his arms around Mark's neck, sobbing into his shoulder, Mark felt something deep, primal, protective ignite in his chest. This wasn't just some neighborly dispute. This wasn't an HOA argument or a CPS complaint. Karen had kidnapped his son, and she was going to pay for it. The moment Mark stepped back onto Karen's porch, the flashing red and blue lights lit up the street. 2 squad cars pulled up, doors flying open as uniformed officers stepped out, one of them, Sergeant Jamie Barlow, already moving with purpose. Barlow was a no-nonsense type, the kind of cop who had seen it all and didn't have time for nonsense. His gaze flicked from Mark, holding Toby, to Karen, standing in the doorway like a deer caught in headlights. Mark didn't even have to explain. She took my son, he said, his voice low, steady, furious. Karen snapped out of her shock. Wait, no, she screeched, running down the porch steps, her hands waving. This is a huge misunderstanding. I was just trying to keep him safe. Barlow barely spared her a glance. Step back, ma'am. Karen's whole body stiffened. But I was just. I said step back. Karen's mouth clamped shut, but Mark could see the way her hands twitched at her sides, the way her eyes darted from him to the officers. She was looking for a way out, a way to talk her way out of this. Barlow turned back to Mark. You got proof? Mark didn't say a word. He just handed over his phone. Barlow took it, watching the security footage, his face completely unreadable. Karen was still shaking, shifting on her feet like she wanted to snatch the phone and smash it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Barlow sighed, shaking his head. Jesus Christ, he muttered. Karen snapped. That's not what happened, she shrieked. You don't understand. I was protecting him. Mark is a single father. He's neglectful, careless. Barlow cut her off with a glare. Ma'am, you walked onto his property, removed a child without consent, and put him into your vehicle. That's unlawful detainment at best. Kidnapping at worst. Karen stumbled back like she had been struck. No, I know, she wailed. I was helping him. He was left alone. Mark finally turned, his rage barely controlled. He wasn't alone. His voice was low, firm, dangerous. I was right there. I have footage of that, too. Barlow held up a hand, silencing them both. He turned to his fellow officer. Take her in. Karen's entire body locked up. Wait. But before she could make a run for it, two officers grabbed her arms, turning her around, pulling her wrists behind her back. The moment she heard the metallic click of handcuffs, she completely lost it. No, you can't do this to me, she shrieked, kicking, struggling, flailing like a child throwing a tantrum. I'm the head of the community. I am not a criminal. Mark watched, expression cold, as Karen was dragged toward the squad car, her wails echoing down the street. Every single neighbor had come outside. Some were filming. Some were whispering. But none of them looked surprised, because Karen had finally gone too far. The moment they tried to shove her into the back seat, she fought harder, kicking at the doors, her face red, hair a mess. Listen to me, she screamed. I'm the victim here. I was just trying to help. Barlow leaned against the car, watching her meltdown with a bored expression. You have the right to remain silent, he said. I suggest you use it. Karen let out one final, ear-piercing shriek before the officer slammed the door shut. And just like that, she was gone. The aftermath. Mark breathed again. His arms tightened around Toby, who buried his face into Mark's neck, sniffling. It's okay, buddy, Mark murmured. It's over. And it was. Karen was gone. CPS officially closed their case, issuing a formal apology for the harassment. The entire neighborhood turned against Karen, her name forever attached to the story of the woman who kidnapped a child because she thought she knew better. Her house? It went up for sale within a month. No one knew where she went. No one cared. And Mark, for the first time in a long, long time, he felt safe. He didn't have to watch his back. He didn't have to dread another knock on his door. And every morning, when Toby ran out into the yard to play, free and happy, Mark just sat on his porch, coffee in hand, watching. Because he could. Because it was finally over. And Karen would never bother them again. Mark had never been the type to relish in someone else's downfall. He had always been the kind of guy to let things go, move forward, focus on what really mattered. But as he stood on his porch the morning after Karen Matheson was hauled away in cuffs, drinking his coffee in the cool morning air, while Toby played freely in the yard, he realized something. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. For months, Karen had tormented him, sticking her nose into his parenting, filing complaints, calling CPS, and ultimately kidnapping his son. She had pushed and pushed and pushed until she pushed herself straight into a jail cell. And now she was gone. Or so he thought. The legal fallout. Karen's arrest made headlines. It started small, a whisper among the neighbors, then a murmur in the local community groups, and then it exploded. The headline popped up on Mark's phone that afternoon, making his stomach do a weird, unfamiliar flip. Oak Hollow woman arrested for kidnapping child, claiming she knew best. There was even a picture of her mugshot, her perfect blonde bob slightly disheveled, her eyes wild and furious, her lips pressed into a thin, humiliated line. Mark wasn't one to stalk the comment section, but curiosity got the best of him. The responses? They were brutal. Holy hell, imagine thinking you can just take someone's kid like that. The way some people have a god complex is terrifying. That woman had crazy PDA mom energy and took it way too far. Single dads get enough judgment as it is. Glad the system actually worked this time. For the first time since moving to Oak Hollow, Mark felt something he hadn't expected. Validation. Because it wasn't just him. It wasn't just his paranoia, his frustration, his exhaustion. Karen had crossed a line, and everyone knew it. And that was only the beginning. The court date. 3 weeks later, Mark found himself standing in a courtroom, watching Karen Matheson face a judge. She sat stiff-backed and furious, wearing a pale blue dress that tried too hard to make her look innocent. But it didn't matter. Nothing could erase what she had done. The judge listed the charges against her: unlawful detainment, filing a false police report, harassment, and attempted custodial interference. Karen sat there, tight-lipped, barely blinking. When asked if she had anything to say, she finally snapped. "This entire thing is ridiculous," she spat, her voice sharp. "I was trying to help. I was doing what no one else would. A child was in danger." The judge cut her off immediately. "The only danger to that child was you, Mrs. Matheson," he said, his voice cool, firm, and final. Karen's face flushed a deep red, but she bit her tongue. In the end, she got 2 years of probation, community service, a restraining order that permanently barred her from ever coming near Mark or Toby again, and the humiliation of being the town's most notorious disgrace. She stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clicking like gunfire against the polished floors, her lawyer trailing behind her, looking embarrassed to even be associated with her. Mark watched her go, feeling nothing but relief. She was done. Karen's final fall. If Karen had any hope of rebuilding her life in Oak Hollow, that hope was shattered within days. The HO of her precious, controlling kingdom held a community vote the following week. The result? A unanimous decision to remove her from any position of authority. Not only that, but her own friends turned on her. One by one, the same women who used to follow her every command suddenly had nothing to do with her. "Oh, we had no idea she was like that," they whispered. "She was always a little too intense. I never liked how she talked about Mark, honestly." In the span of a month, Karen Matheson went from the most feared woman in Oak Hollow to a social pariah. No more HOA meetings. No more influence. No more power. And the cherry on top, her husband left her. Turns out he hadn't been a fan of her little kidnapping stunt. The house went on the market a few weeks later, a for sale sign posted out front like a badge of shame. And then, just like that, Karen was gone. A life without Karen. Mark hadn't realized how much of his energy had been tied up in fighting her off until she was no longer there. At first, he expected her to reappear somehow, like some horror movie villain who refuses to die. But weeks turned into months, and months into a year, and with each passing day, Mark felt lighter. Toby could play in the yard without constant worry. No more petty HOA fights. No more watchful eyes through the blinds. No more fake reports. For the first time since moving to Oak Hollow, Mark felt at home. And one evening, as he grilled burgers in the backyard, Toby ran up to him, his eyes bright and full of joy. "Daddy." Mark looked down. "Yeah, buddy." Toby grinned. "Can we get a puppy?" Mark laughed, ruffling his son's hair. "You know what?" he said. "Yeah, I think we can. Because this was the life he had fought for. A life where he and his son could finally just live. No Karen. No fear. Just peace. And that was worth everything." Mark had spent so much time fighting battles he never should have had to fight. At first, it was just annoyances: Karen's meddling, her judgmental stares, her constant need to control everything around her. But then she had escalated, digging her claws into his life, weaponizing the system against him. She had tried to steal his son. She had lied, manipulated, and destroyed herself in the process. And now, she was gone. The house that once belonged to Karen Matheson sat vacant, the windows dark, the lawn overgrown, the for sale sign out front growing rusted with time. Oak Hollow moved on from her, the same way a person moves on from a bad headache, a dull ache that fades into nothing. Mark never thought about her anymore. Until one day, someone brought her up. The unexpected encounter. It happened at the grocery store, of all places. Mark had just picked Toby up from school, and the two of them were debating the finer points of which cereal to buy. Toby, of course, was firmly in the chocolate everything camp, while Mark was just trying to get him something with fiber. "Daddy," Toby said seriously, clutching a box of chocolate blaster puffs. "This one has a dinosaur on it." Mark squinted at the box. "Pretty convincing argument, kid." He was about to concede the battle when a voice he hadn't heard in a long, long time, spoke from behind him. "You've done a good job with him." Mark turned, and for a split second, his stomach clenched, because standing there was Lisa Caldwell, one of Karen's old HOA cronies. She was different now, more tired, more subdued, like someone who had been forced to look in the mirror and not liked what they saw. Mark felt Toby step closer to him, his little fingers curling around the edge of Mark's jacket. Lisa noticed and held up her hands. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said quickly. I just wanted to say something." Mark didn't respond, but he didn't walk away either. Lisa glanced at Toby, then back at Mark. "We were wrong," she said simply. Mark's brows furrowed. "Excuse me?" Lisa exhaled, shifting her bag from one hand to the other. "We were wrong. About you. About Karen. About all of it." Mark wasn't sure what to say to that. Lisa fidgeted. "I didn't know," she admitted. "I mean, I did, but I didn't want to. It was easier to just go along with her." Mark's jaw tightened. Lisa swallowed hard. "And when she took your son, when she actually went through with it," she shook her head, "I realized something. I had been helping a monster." Mark's hands curled into fists at his sides. It had been so long since he thought about it, about the fear, the helplessness, the way his heart nearly stopped when he saw Karen driving away with Toby in her car. Lisa saw the tension in his face and stepped back. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said quietly. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." Mark was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded, not in forgiveness, but in acknowledgement. Lisa gave him a small, grateful smile, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the aisles. Mark exhaled slowly, glancing down at Toby, who was watching him carefully. "You okay, buddy?" Mark asked. Toby nodded. "Yeah, I just don't like talking about her." Mark ruffled his son's hair. "Me neither, kid." Moving forward. They never saw Lisa again after that. She moved away not long after, a fresh start, or maybe just a way to escape the past. Mark didn't waste time thinking about it, because he had his own fresh start. Karen was gone. Oak Hollow had changed for the better. Mark was thriving at work. Toby was excelling in school. And every morning, when he stepped out onto his porch, he felt something new, something that had been missing for so long. Peace. No more Karen. No more fear. Just him and his son. And that was all he had ever wanted. Then